The UK made a mistake. It's time to let bygones be bygones and ask the EU to take the country back. But what's compelling the European Union to consider re-entry? Nothing. However, that's an oversimplification. Still, if you were to narrow it down to what the EU serves to gain from the UK rejoining and what the UK does with re-entry, the scales are tipped in the British favour. After publicly calling out the coalition for not protecting British sentiments, distancing itself from the largest union in Europe, and claiming that it would be better off without it, would you accept Britain back as a member state? Shifting sentiments, regrets, and unfair repercussions, there's no going back now. Who is Gina Miller? She's a business owner and an activist, but before 2016, no one had ever heard of Gina Miller. Yet in 2016, she was the recipient of hate mail and numerous death threats, all because she'd challenged the UK's decision to leave the European Union, and actually won. Today in 2024, we can see that despite an earlier victory, Gina might have won the battle, but lost the war. We're now living in a post-Brexit world. Still, Gina is adamant that things can go back to how they were. All the UK has to do is rejoin the EU. Miller brought a legal case against the UK government in 2016, arguing that only Parliament reserved the right to invoke Article 50 and actually exit the EU. The government could not. The case was heard by a panel of 3 judges who agreed with Miller. Only Parliament reserved that right. The High Court echoed Miller's concerns that giving the government the right would remove the public's individuality. Most of us remember 2016 as the year that Britain unofficially exited the EU, but because of Miller, that wasn't the case. The correct timeline would start from 2017, specifically January of that year, when the Supreme Court heard the case again and achieved another verdict. The Parliament didn't need to give its consent, and the government brought forward legislation providing the Prime Minister the power to notify. Miller was not willing to go down without a fight. She endured too much to get where she was to stand down. 8 cease and desist letters were issued to people who'd sent her hate mail, and Rodri Phillips, the 4th Viscount St. David's, had to be jailed for extreme racial abuse and setting a reward for anyone who'd run over Miller. She'd won her November 2016 case and believed she could reclaim that victory again in 2019 when she brought a second case in front of the Supreme Court. The decision was unanimously squashed. The businesswoman claimed that her motivation was never to undo Brexit, it was simply to take back power from the government and give it to the British public. Many believed that Miller, like several Remain supporters, believed that the results of the referendum were too narrow to make a hasty decision. A second or even a third referendum was necessary. You have to remember here that England had a population of 55.2 million in 2016, where Leave voters dominated, albeit by a narrow margin. On the other hand, Scotland's population was 5 million, where the Remain voters were in a majority by a greater margin. In the end, however, as part of the United Kingdom, Scotland exited the EU similar to England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Speaking of which, Northern Ireland had voted to remain too. What's happening now? According to Gina Miller, Brexit has become the topic of conversation yet again. This time, however, the hate mail that's been flooding her mailbox for 4 years has been replaced by fan mail. Great Britain's membership in the EU has been questioned twice, once in 2016 when the debate came to a head and people wanted to leave. Now in 2022, when people want to stay. And Miller has been recalled into that conversation again, but she says undoing Brexit will not be easy. The businesswoman claimed that the UK is now being treated as a third country. Talks with the EU, especially to rejoin the coalition, will not be easy. But it can be done. For that, Miller wants the government to invoke Article 49, the less popular article, the one unheard of. Article 49 naturally involves details regarding joining the coalition. It states that any European state which represents the common EU values and is committed to promoting them may apply to become a member of the Union. Additionally, the Copenhagen criteria needs to be met, namely a functioning economy and institutional capacity to deal with the EU and abide by its laws. Above all, however, the UK needs political stability, guaranteeing that the nation will remain a democratic nation, ensuring the rule of law. If those are the parameters for re-entry, Miller believes that the UK can join the coalition all over again, but will things go back to the way they were? No, they won't, and maybe that's not what the public advocating to rejoin want either. More on that in a minute. But say the UK invoked Article 49 tomorrow, how long would it take before the country becomes a member state again? According to Miller, it's taken the EU on average 9 years to complete terms of entry into the coalition, citing examples such as Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, and Latvia. Other supporters, such as Professor Jacob Oberg, believe that it could actually take the UK a fraction of that time, give or take 3 years, possibly less. Examples include Sweden and Finland. But Miller was as critical of the government in 2024 as she was in 2016, claiming that it would be hard for the UK to gain re-entry if the current trends were followed. The Technis survey for independent media showed 43% in favor of rejoining the bloc, compared to 40% who want to stay out, per a June 2024 poll. While the margins were narrow, they were so back in 2016 too, when Brexit was carried out. In any case, the results are definitive. Leave voters were a majority then, but they're a minority now. In September 2023, a large protest gathered in London to demand the government rejoin the EU. France and Germany, two of the largest contributors to the EU budget, agreed. However, re-entry would come at a cost. In exchange for entry into the EU single market, the EU would have to abide by the European Court of Justice and would have to contribute to the EU's budget. This outpost situation isn't one Britain's wholly unfamiliar with. The UK, even when it was a member, enjoyed crafted perks that kept it from adopting the euro as a currency and accepting certain parts of Home Affairs policy, among other things, namely a special budget rebate. Denmark likewise has certain perks too. Still, that was not when the UK was a member of the EU and the coalition had to negotiate with the nation. Now the roles are reversed. The EU presents its terms and the UK has the ability to agree with them or walk away. The EU holds all the cards. So Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, told the people, especially those who are concerned about the EU's apparent leverage, that he would ensure the nation got the best possible deal. To some people, the deal was disparaging, and to others, it served as a reminder that expansion of the EU and its operations could only be achieved if the UK was part of the coalition, even as an associate member. Which begs the question, why are we giving into their demands when they should be giving into ours? France and Germany would be spearheading the expansion, which is predicted to take place by 2030 and be the largest reform to the EU budget since the Lisbon Treaty. For his part, Starmer claims that he would be willing to negotiate a change. A lot of ifs right now, but Starmer's reliance on re-entry into the EU and pushing forward premiership served to prove that people in the UK are willing to see things through with the EU. The biggest question is, would the EU be willing to see things through? Let's revert back and see what she has to say about the UK's re-entry into the EU. As a firm believer that the UK should be part of the EU, Miller realised the problems associated with re-entry. For one, she claimed that the British would have to accept a budget rebate, special justice, and home affairs management. 3 of the outposts when the UK was a member state would be more problematic to achieve the second time around. To re-enter, the UK wouldn't only need to hold a potential referendum to determine its position in the coalition, but also need the approval of member states and of the European Parliament. But how far can you go with bad faith? The Labour Party might have sentiments that reflect wanting to rejoin the EU, but what about the Conservative Party? If Starmer rejoins the EU during his terms, who's to say that a Conservative MP wouldn't cause trouble when they're in power? Again, a lot of ifs. The EU would need definite proof that Brexitism has been squashed in the UK, or at least so in Parliament. In any case, they would demand more guarantees that the UK would not hold another referendum to undo what the second one did, which in turn was attempting to undo what the first one did. As far as the referendum is concerned, we're unsure even now if the UK would hold such a massive election or simply go off polling data, which shows that a good majority of people regret leaving the EU, namely the single market. Business owners are at the helm of protests in London when it comes to wanting the government to undo Brexit. It might have something to do with the European single market, a single trading body formed by the EU that allows the free movement of goods between member states. While it might sound like a dream to some, it was a nightmare to many during the 2016 referendum. UK politicians who opposed the European single market often highlighted several significant drawbacks they believed justified leaving the EU. A primary concern was the perceived erosion of national sovereignty. They argued that membership in the single market necessitated adherence to EU regulations and standards, which they saw as an imposition on the UK's ability to self-govern. This was especially contentious regarding laws on employment, environmental standards, and consumer protections, which some felt were overly stringent and not tailored to the UK's specific needs. Another major issue was immigration control. The principle of free movement within the EU meant that the UK could not restrict the number of EU citizens coming to live and work in the country. Politicians argued that this led to increased pressure on public services such as the NHS, housing, and education, and contributed to wage suppression in certain sectors. They contended that regaining control over immigration policies was crucial for managing these impacts effectively. Economically, critics of the single market suggested that it stiffed the UK's ability to form independent trade agreements with non-EU countries. They believed that leaving the EU would allow the UK to negotiate more favourable trade deals globally, potentially boosting the economy. Additionally, there were concerns about the financial contributions the UK made to the EU budget, which some politicians argued could be better spent domestically. Today, that's changed. If we were to look at what the EU has to offer the UK, we could argue that the EU seeks to gain as much from the country too. The UK is one of the largest economies in Europe, a major contributor to the EU budget, and would aid the single market. However, when the UK was part of the EU, countries such as France butted heads with the nation several times over political integration. That is, member states wanted political integration of most, if not all, of Europe, including Eastern Europe, whereas the UK opposed this notion. Becoming an associate member would allow the EU to move forward with its goals and also add the UK to the European Defence Plan, without the UK posing a real obstacle to its plans and move east. But why would it? Following Brexit, the EU became the UK's largest trading partner, while the UK ranked as the EU's largest trading partner after the United States and China. Certain EU member states, such as Belgium, Cyprus, Ireland, Germany, and the Netherlands, were more vulnerable to economic shocks resulting from Brexit. Ireland's economy, in particular, faced significant risk due to its shared land border and closed agribusiness ties with the UK. The reintroduction of a customs border posed economic and political challenges, especially threatening the Northern Ireland peace process. To maintain open borders in Ireland, the UK and EU renegotiated the Northern Ireland Protocol, effectively keeping Northern Ireland within the EU customs union in some respects. Brexit caused trouble for the EU, shaking up its foundation. In the years since the UK's exit, the EU has been able to recenter and reorient, focusing more so now on undoing what happened when one of its largest economies left the bloc. Why would the coalition readily accept the UK back without repercussions? Even if the UK rejoins, the EU would keep it at arm's length until all anti-EU sentiments had been squashed. Would that ever happen? Unlikely, but not impossible. In the meanwhile, the EU holds the cards, and they'll be able to determine the UK's place in the bloc or how the UK can reap some benefits without gaining full entry. Likewise, how they can gain more from the UK in light of changing sentiments.